The applause in the private dining room froze into a thin, embarrassed sound when he laughed. A rich, clipped laugh that belonged to someone who fed on other people's discomfort. He said the word wrong louder than anyone needed, as if pronunciation could measure worth, and the room shifted. That single cruel syllable would not have mattered if it stopped there. But Jonathan Caldwell, billionaire investor and face of a new tech consortium, had the habit of turning small slights into instruments of control. What he did not expect was the woman behind the pass, whose voice trembled with a soft accent, to answer back with a sentence that made him stand and, slowly, apologize. This moment mattered because it was not only about a rude remark. It was the contact that unspooled a hidden thread, the tiny human exchange that led to documents, metadata, and a legal paper trail willing to unmake a reputation. Maya Alvarez, 29, worked nights at the Meridian, a glossy hotel restaurant where chandeliers picked the dust from the air, and waiters learned to be invisible to power. She had been invisible on purpose for years, a strategy born from loss and a decision to survive rather than fight. Yet the night she corrected a billionaire in a voice that carried a university accent he could not mock was the first visible stitch in a plan to reclaim name and evidence everyone thought gone. The brass lamps hummed and smelled faintly of lemon polish, while a cello note from the lobby drifted through the paneled walls. The table candles shifted shadows like slow breath, and the clink of expensive cutlery made ordinary movements sound like decisions. Across from Maya, the leather of Caldwell's chair creaked with entitlement. Behind him, his aide, Nora Price, moved like an extension of his will, arranging plates and deference. Across the room, a woman in a jade coat watched, her eyes curious without being kind. The story that follows will be about language and law, about a signature that was never supposed to be found, and about how a shy waitress found allies who could read the code left in a file no one else noticed. Stay with the account until the end to see who gained voice and who paid for arrogance. Maya's days were measured in orders, folded napkins, and the small economy of tips. She rose before dawn in a studio apartment whose single window framed a stairwell, where the city's noise came filtered and familiar. She learned to move without announcing herself, a practice that had begun in childhood, when speaking up meant attracting punishment from people meant to protect her. The first paragraph of her backstory began in a neighborhood where ambition collided with limited offers. Her parents emigrated with an old recipe book and an idea of safety that the city later refused to guarantee. She studied on scholarship at a local technical institute and, for a while, believed in the promise of credentials and steady pay. Her second paragraph of memory held a bruise that was not visible to strangers. A graduate fellowship at a university lab had been the pivot that almost became a career. There, she worked with algorithms and matched data sets, producing models small enough to fit inside a patent application and precise enough to matter to venture capitalists. For a moment, she felt the rise of stability under her feet, until a partner named Julian Price, who later became a senior executive at Caldwell Enterprises, used corporate maneuvers to erase her authorship. Reports were rewritten, credits reassigned, and when she protested, her identity as a creator was quietly anonymized. The loss was not only professional, it cost her reputation and the chance at continuity in a field that rarely forgives gaps. The third paragraph of her past described what she had given up to survive. After court filings stalled and academic allies retreated under pressure, she left the lab. She took hospitality work to pay debts and keep a roof over her head. Nights waiting tables kept her connected to a city that talked loudly about capital and quietly about who made it possible. Yet she kept one habit from the lab. She kept copies of notes, of timestamped sketches, of a single file she could not afford to destroy. It was buried in cloud storage under a throwaway email and accessible only through a chain of metadata she had barely learned to read. That small, stubborn file would become the hinge of every later choice. Her routine at the Meridian began with a checklist of textures and sounds. The linen smelt faintly of starch. The espresso machine hissed like a small animal. She learned the faces of regulars the way a botanist learns leaf shapes. Among them were patrons like Marco Silva, the head chef whose quick laugh hid a slow generosity, and Zara Kim, a sommelier who kept gossip like currency stowed behind each bottle. Photos on the wall showed Jonathan Caldwell smiling with architects. Maya took orders with a voice that softened around names and hard numbers. When Caldwell arrived that night, it was because the hotel hosted investors from abroad and because power often moved in circles where a quiet correction could feel like a threat. The inciting incident happened at the back pass after service. Maya had delivered a dessert to table 12, where Caldwell sat with 3 business partners, an expensive scarf pulled across his lap. He mispronounced a French phrasing that had been passed down in the dessert's recipe, chuckled loudly, and called attention to the waitress's accent. That was the social strike. The dialogue in the room unfolded like a negotiation where manners became weapons. Caldwell said, slightly mockingly, "Who taught you English, child?" Maya replied, measured, "I learned at the university in Guadalajara." He laughed, "You have an accent. Do you correct French chefs too?" Maya, steady, "No, I correct when someone is wrong about a recipe." Nora Price, his aide, shifted, "Sir, she is very good at her job." Caldwell, leaning forward, "And what else are you good at, Maya?" Hands calm, "I used to work with data models. I helped build a prototype for predictive maintenance." His laugh turned thin. "Are you claiming to have built things from my firms, Maya?" Quietly, "I am claiming the work I did was mine. It was never given back." Caldwell, frowning, "You should be careful accusing people in my presence." Maya, softer, "I only ask that words match facts." A pause. A server refolded a napkin. The jade coat woman lifted a glass and set it down like an exclamation. The exchange seemed small, an instance of class collision. Yet, in that quiet correction, there was a name mentioned that nobody wanted repeated at the table: Julian Price. The sound of that name in Caldwell's ears nudged a memory about a contract clause and a signature dated 3 years earlier. Later, when Maya returned to the kitchen and scrolled through a message on her phone, a notification caught her eye. It contained a photo of a vintage university page mentioning Julian Price as an author on a paper she knew she had drafted. The pulse in her throat was now a call to action. She began to search. Her investigation was methodical, the cautious movement that once made her a respected junior analyst. She opened her old throwaway email and, with a patience learned from nights of cataloging receipts, located a folder with a backup file. The file name was Bland. Inside the document, the author tag had been removed, but digital habits leave traces. She noticed a set of metadata entries showing a series of saves across cloud servers. There was a timestamp, a machine IP linked to an office in the same building as Caldwell Enterprises, and an odd signature token in a PDF that suggested a digital signing service had been used. She printed a page at a public library and watched the ink dry like a promise. The initial investigation introduced 3 named people who reacted in small ways. Marco Silva, the chef, put his palm on it and said, "If that is yours, we will help." Zara Kim suggested contacting Priya Das, a journalist she knew. Priya, who had a soft, relentless curiosity, responded with a single line: "I know a lawyer who handles intellectual property suits pro bono." That lawyer was Samuel Reed. Samuel listened on a cracked video call, asking practical questions and naming consequences calmly. He explained what due diligence would demand, that they needed to establish chain of custody for the file, and the record showing the signature was falsified. He mentioned a clause common in corporate contracts where authorship could be reassigned only if a specific countersignature existed. Hearing the legal terms made Maya feel a mixture of hope and vertigo. At this stage, the screenplay of the investigation included the team commissioned a forensic review of document metadata and file headers. The report, 300 characters of technical clarity, showed non-repudiation tokens mismatched to Julian Price's access logs, a signature hash that did not match the corporate signing certificate, and timestamp anomalies consistent with post-factum edits to the PDF's properties. In plain language, the signature was not only reassigned but contrived. Maya's alliance with allies deepened into a formal plan. Daniel Park, an investigative reporter at the City Ledger, arrived with questions and a recorder. He had a reputation for digging into boardroom scandals. Samuel Reed, the IP attorney, prepared a legal pathway. Dr. Elena Ortiz, a digital forensic expert at Harbor Labs, agreed to run a complete chain of custody simulation. Priya Das, the journalist, promised coverage timed to protect source anonymity until court filings were ready. Each name became a tool and a witness. The dialogue between Maya and Daniel in a cramped cafe near the courthouse became the locus of strategy and courage. Daniel said, "You understand the risk if this goes public too early, right?" Maya answered, "I do. I also understand the risk of never trying." Daniel, pragmatic, "We will need originals, witnesses, and a sequence of filings to freeze assets." Maya, resolute, "Freeze assets." She said the words like a vow. Samuel, on speaker, "First, we file a preliminary injunction claiming wrongful attribution and fraudulent signature." Dr. Elena Ortiz, precise, "I will produce a report showing the hash mismatch and document tampering." Priya, quietly, "I will hold the story until you say go." Maya, looking at the coffee cup, "Who will speak for me in public?" Daniel, gentle, "We can share your story without revealing details that put you at risk. You decide when to step forward." Maya, almost smiling, "I want my name back, not a headline." Each conversational exchange contained strategy and tenderness. The team rehearsed how to present evidence in a way that a court could accept. Samuel explained what due diligence meant in this context, a process where opposing counsel examines documents to confirm authenticity and chain of control. He set up a sequence to request a temporary restraining order while the lab completed its forensic analysis. The plan involved exposing internal emails that suggested deliberate reassignment of credit and a clause in a contract that appeared to have been backdated. There were moments of tension that stretched into long minutes of self-interrogation for Maya. Once, sitting alone on a park bench, she felt the old shame that had kept her quiet return with new heat. She remembered a professor who had praised her code and then withdrawn when the board called. She pictured her mother folding laundry, telling her that survival sometimes required silence. The tension was a tightness at the sternum, followed by a slow intake of breath. She asked herself whether exposing powerful men would cost more than the loss she had already suffered. The decision pressed like heat under her skin. A lid. In 2 paragraphs, she acknowledged fear, called memory by name, and chose action. Another extended tension happened the morning the injunction was filed. News feeds flickered, and her phone vibrated with anonymous threats and messages of support. There was a private moment in the courthouse elevator where she felt the weight of visible accusation. She thought of Julian Price, who had once smiled when she explained the model, and of Jonathan Caldwell, who controlled reputations like capital. Between 2 short breaths, she rehearsed her testimony, the sound of her voice lined with the words she had practiced. The pause before stepping into the courtroom lasted longer than any single sentence. She felt both very small and very enormous at once. The confrontation unfolded in a packed conference room where Caldwell's legal team attempted to dismiss the case as a misunderstanding. The exchanges there were the longest, the most public, and included formal testimony, objections, and a steady unraveling of the billionaire's narrative. The scene had vivid sensory markers. The room smelled of polished wood and old paper. Cameras hummed like distant insects. The judge's robe made a soft swish each time she adjusted position. Caldwell's voice was controlled, his smile tight. Samuel Reed spoke measuredly, presenting the Dr. Ortiz's report and the chain of custody logs. The dialogue during the deposition covered 12 direct exchanges between Maya and opposing counsel, each revealing layers of intent and fact. Opposing counsel: Cool. Miss Alvarez, are you alleging that Mr. Price falsified authorship? Maya: Clear. I am alleging my authorship was taken and that a signature attached to a corporate file was not mine. Opposing counsel: Incredulous. Do you have proof beyond your recollection? Samuel Reed, firmly: We have forensic analysis and server logs showing anomalous timestamps. Counsel: Aggressive. How do you explain your presence in the hospitality industry if you were a scientist? Maya: Honest. I worked to survive while keeping these documents. Counsel, sarcastic: Convenient backup copies then. Dr. Elena Ortiz, precise: The file's hash values changed after server events tied to Caldwell Enterprises networks. Counsel, objecting: Your witness lacks foundation. Judge, stern: Objection overruled. Proceed. Daniel, from the press table, murmuring: We will publish if the court allows. Counsel, pointed to Caldwell: Has your client ever used pressure to reassign authorship? Caldwell, smooth: My companies follow proper procedure and due diligence in all acquisitions. Samuel, showing an email: That procedure was not followed in dozens of internal communications. Maya, finishing: I only want my name on the work I did. The tension during this exposure occupied several minutes that felt like a small eternity. Memory flashed, evidence was presented, and for once, ordinary details like the order of save files and the smell of coffee in the conference room mattered as proof. The legal moment where the judge allowed a temporary injunction to freeze certain assets was both victory and beginning. It did not undo past erasure, but it stopped further manipulation. The immediate consequences were messy and public. Headlines used words like lawsuit and scandal. The City Ledger and other outlets named individuals. Jonathan Caldwell issued a careful apology that read like damage control and then retracted parts when lawyers advised. Maya received messages from strangers and from former colleagues who had been silent years before. Here are at least 7 named reactions that mapped the community around the story. Nora Price, Caldwell's aide, resigned the week the injunction was filed and later gave a small interview noting she had seen irregularities. Marco Silva, the chef, organized a fundraiser to help Maya with legal fees and gave a statement about supporting workplace integrity. Zara Kim wrote a column about class and food. Priya Das wrote an investigative piece that tied corporate documents to public records. Samuel Reed filed a motion to compel discovery. Dr. Elena Ortiz presented the forensic report in court and then lectured at the university about digital ethics. Judge Harriet Cole, who presided over the preliminary hearing, asked pointed questions that surprised both sides. Public reaction split into threads. Some accused Maya of opportunism. Others hailed her perseverance. Financial analysts noted an immediate dip in Caldwell Enterprises stock after filings suggested internal misfeasance. The company's board called an emergency meeting. The process of discovery revealed emails where Julian Price had discussed moving credits and suggested a rewritten author line to improve acquisition prospects. The term patent surfaced repeatedly because the technology underlying Maya's model had been part of a provisional patent filing. Samuel explained in a press statement that patent claims hinge on original authorship and that a successful claim could restore both credit and licensing rights. The months after the hearing mapped a slow arc of recovery and consequence. 1 month later, Maya had regained provisional recognition in an institutional report and had started teaching a night class in data ethics at a community college. She used the pay to stabilize her finances and accepted an invitation to speak at a small symposium where students listened like hungry birds. Priya's long-form article included interviews with Marco, Zara, and Nora, and was widely shared. 3 months out, the injunction led to a wider internal investigation at Caldwell Enterprises. Nora's testimony and Dr. Ortiz's forensic timeline pressured the board. Jonathan Caldwell issued an apology that included the word responsibility and a mention of systemic failures. He agreed to mediation and to a review of authorship protocols across his firms. Maya's name began to appear on early press releases as a contributor rather than a cautionary footnote. 6 months later, the concrete outcomes had multiplied beyond headlines. A settlement returned rights to the technology's licensing revenue and included a clause for a trust to fund scholarships for underrepresented students in tech. Samuel negotiated terms that preserved her anonymity when she wanted it and restored public credit when she chose. Maya opened a small consultancy focused on ethical data practices and curated a fellowship named after her mother to support students from immigrant backgrounds. The legal record listed a finding that certain signatures had been falsified and recommended further investigation. Julian Price left the company and faced an internal review that affected his career trajectory. Jonathan Caldwell agreed to an external audit and to a public program addressing corporate authorship ethics. The settlement did not erase the past, but it created structures to prevent the same erasure from happening to others. The final intimate scene returned us to a kitchen washed in morning sun. Maya and Marco stood by a small table with a pot of coffee and a stack of notebooks she had kept through the process. Marco handed her a chipped mug, and for a moment they were just two people who had weathered storms. There was a small tenderness between them, a quiet, mutual respect. She asked Marco to teach her a recipe he said he would never share. He laughed and agreed, and the lesson began with the sound of water and the scent of garlic. Around them, the city moved on, but there was a clear difference. Her name had been reclaimed, her voice had been heard. Justice had not been loud or spectacular. It had been meticulous, procedural, and human. If this story made you feel anger or relief, write felt and tell us what you would do in a similar situation. Your responses help others who had been silenced know they are not alone and help prioritize which stories need deeper investigation. Now that you have shared your voice, continue with the story to see how evidence, testimony, and unexpected apologies reshaped more than one powerful life. In the months that followed, Maya kept building. She lectured at the Technical Institute where she once studied, advocating for clearer attribution policies and stronger protections for junior researchers. She partnered with Priya and Daniel on a seminar about investigative reporting and ethics, bringing in Dr. Elena Ortiz to demonstrate how seemingly trivial file properties could topple false narratives. Samuel Reed started an outreach program offering pro bono help to creators seeking to reclaim work. Marco's fundraiser turned into a small nonprofit that provided stipends to students who took unpaid internships. Nora found work at a nonprofit focused on corporate transparency and spoke candidly about her regret and her role in allowing practices to persist. Each name in the network became part of the remedy. The legal world took notice. Universities began revising guidelines on authorship, and the term due diligence became everyday vocabulary in labs and startups. The phrase signature digital was discussed in seminars, and IT departments instituted stricter non-repudiation protocols to preserve evidentiary chains. The story became a case study taught in a law school class about intellectual property and ethics because it demonstrated both the human cost of erased credit and the practical forensic methods that could restore truth. The patent that had once been obscured was now part of a licensing agreement that funded community workshops and a scholarship in Maya's mother's name. But beyond policies and settlements, the most lasting change was quieter. People who had once seen silence as the only survival strategy began to weigh risks differently. They found a vocabulary for reclaiming work, and they found, in Maya's example, the idea that visibility could be chosen rather than forced. Her apology scene with Caldwell had not been theatrical. It began when he acknowledged, publicly and awkwardly, that his tone had been cruel and that privilege had blinded him to the consequences of a dismissive laugh. His apology, imperfect and late, was accompanied by concrete action steps that included internal audits and a commitment to fund attribution training across subsidiaries. The apology mattered because it was tied to corrective measures, not just regret. The last image is of Maya in a small classroom, sunlight on notebook pages, speaking softly about ethics and the mechanics of evidence. Students leaned forward. Her voice retained its accent, which she no longer felt obliged to soften. When she spoke about metadata and chain of custody, she did so with the calm precision of someone who had been both erased and restored. She closed by saying that reclaiming a name often required more than courage. It required allies who could read the files and a system willing to accept truth. If you want more stories about people who turn silence into accountability, subscribe and follow this series. Stories like Maya's remind us that justice can be patient, technical, and deeply personal. In the end, she taught the city one lesson that is worth repeating. She learned that a soft voice can shift a whole ledger of power.